Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review, where we have our AI, DesignEye, look at a design or a competition piece of mine from previous years and give us some feedback in terms of the principles and elements of design, which is the way we are judged in competition, as well as some suggestions for improving the design, helping it to better meet the requirements of those guidelines. This week we're looking actually at a practice design, a design there that I did hoping that I would extend or expand my design infrastructure, for want of a better word. It's entitled Coiled Spring, simply because the basis for it, the structure for it was a spring, a suspension spring from a car or a truck. I think it's fairly large, so either I don't really know how it got into my just in case stash that I have in the storage area, but it was there and I hadn't used it, and I thought I'll try. I'll see what I can do with it. I also wanted to try something that was a little bit more, not minimalist so much, but using plant materials that I don't normally use, just to see if I could get a feel for how I could use them. So this design, in essence, when it was finished, was about 40 centimetres wide and about 85 centimetres in height. So it would fit in comfortably into most competition staging areas. I've used as the base a slice of Banksia, which you will have seen in many other of my designs, and I've tried to make it a little bit contemporary or abstract, except for the placement of the plant material. But that sort of grey area between contemporary and abstract designs that we seem to be faced with at the moment. The spring itself is covered in jute rope, and I haven't made it too structured. You'll see that there's one section of it where I've joined the rope that I've left the frayed edge there just to give it a little bit of interest and a change in the texture, even though it's the same material. Coconut fibre, obviously, as you can see, and some Sansevieria, or called in this country mother-in-law tongue, to provide the fresh plant material. This doesn't need a water source, so it can be glued or placed in a design without a water source needing to be there. It is tall and narrow, and that's the style of design that I don't often do. So this was also a challenge to be able to use these in a design where I felt that they were complementary to the design. So let's now see what AI can tell us about this particular design. And I did say when I submitted the image to it that it was called Coiled Spring. So what it has said, first of all, is that this compact sculptural composition is an excellent study in form, texture and line, integrating natural materials in a controlled and rhythmic construction. Coiled Spring is aptly titled. The repetition of circular rope forms evokes both energy of a spring and the season's themes of awakening and emergence. So because I was so focused on the physical spring that I had to use, I didn't think about it being a way that you could depict spring, the season, which is interesting as well. So something that was a dual purpose design that I'll keep in mind for future competitions. I like the idea that it has its first reaction to the design itself is that it's a study of form, texture and line, because that's really what I was trying to do in utilising the materials that I had on hand to put this design together. Let's look now individually at the principles and elements of design. Balance, first of all. The design achieves asymmetrical balance. The coiled elements are visually dense in the centre, while the tall vertical foliage on either side offsets that density. So what it's saying there is that your eye is not drawn to the centre, that there's a visual balance and negative space in the design. That means that you look at it as a whole. It's not just overwhelmed by that central part of where the spring is. The visual weight is grounded by the circular wood slice base, providing physical and visual stability. And that's true once again, without that dominating, and bearing in mind that the internal colour of that slice is matched by the coconut fibre. The taller Sansevieria leaves to the left are balanced by the outward sweep of the coconut fibre to the right, creating diagonal counterbalance. And that's interesting because it's not something that I particularly focused on. I was just trying to utilise those individual elements, but it's good to see, and I can look back at this image as you would if you were submitting your own designs for analysis, and look at the image and see what it's saying and understand what it's saying in terms of something that I didn't see when I originally did the design. Proportion and scale. The proportions are well considered. The verticality of the leaves stretches the visual height, while the width remains modest, making this a refined, space-efficient composition. So a vertical design, basically. The coils are proportionate to the leaves, enhancing the central theme without dominating, which is what I just said earlier, that it's all in scale and proportion to one another. The base size is appropriate, offering grounding without excess bulk. So what we're seeing here is that in terms of proportion and scale is that everything works with everything else. There's nothing that's overly dominant. Now, in terms of the foliage, it would be very easy to get that proportion and scale wrong, to use something that was not as structured or sculptural as the Sansevieria leaves. You know, you couldn't use palm leaves, you couldn't use gum leaves, you couldn't use aspidistra. You might get away with, but the more vertical and tall leaves, so you could probably get away with the Guimeal lily leaf or sections of it, or typha or flax. But in those, you wouldn't get the variation in colour that you do with the Sansevieria leaves. So let's look at rhythm and movement now. The repetition of the coiled rope segments creates a clear rhythmic pulse through the centre. The twists of coconut fibre mimic the loosened energy of a spring, suggesting a movement outward and upward. The vertical lines of the Sansevieria guide the eye upward, reinforcing this upward motion. So what we've got is a design that's not too heavy on the base, but gives you that grounding, but is pushing itself up all of the way. So that's a good way of using leaves that aren't a little bit twisted, that are not perfectly upright and straight, because I think that you would lose a little bit of that movement that is inherent in this design if you had very straight leaves like the leaves I talked about earlier. And it's interesting that it sees the coiled rope segments as rope segments, not as a spring, because it can't see the back of the design as well as you can when you see it physically. It's only assessing on the image. Contrast and dominance. There's an engaging contrast of textures. Smooth linear Sansevieria versus the coarse fibrous coconut husk, tight curls versus airy fibres. So interesting that the contrast in textures, and as you know if you've seen any of the other videos, is contrast of textures is what I like, is what I look for. We've also got the smoothness of the Sansevieria leaves that are semi-shiny, you know, depending on where the light is. If this was a competition, depending on where the light is, you might get that shiny surface as well. And then you've got the dull surfaces that would contrast with that. The coiled rope structure is the dominant feature, drawing immediate attention with its rhythmic form and centered placement. And that was something that I did deliberately because it was exactly the right size for that particular bit of Banksia that it's placed on as the base. There is less contrast in colour, which helps maintain harmony, but could be elevated for more visual impact. And that's, I think, true. I obviously wanted to use particular plant material in this design when I was practicing, and I wanted to get the colour combinations right between the base, the coils, the spring that had the rope around them, and the coconut fibre. I think that the Sansevieria in this case, because it's got the variegation and because it's got two of them, I've got the yellow edges to them, gives you a bit of a bright pop in colour. To have something else that was introduced that was more colour again, I might have to go for some sisal, which is plant-based material, in a colour that I could replace some of the coconut fibre with, but really have to think about it carefully in terms of introducing another colour. Unity and harmony. The design materials, natural fibres and earthy, work together cohesively. The colour palette is warm and harmonious, greens, browns and beiges. The design has a strong sense of unity through repetition, and the the materials visually speak the same language. So they're all, in terms of harmony, and that's that unity and that scale and proportion all comes into being, and it's not detracted by the contrast in the texture. So something that we need to keep in mind is that we might be bringing something in a design all together, and then there's something in one of the other elements or principles that throws it out completely and puts us off and makes us feel like it's just not quite right. So all of these things are important in terms of a good design at the end of the day. Line. The piece plays on strong vertical lines from the Sansevieria leaves and circular rhythmic lines from the coiled rope. But the line itself is very much a vertical placements. The subtle implied lines from the sweep of the coconut fibre and the curve of the coils give the design direction and flow. So whilst that circular rhythmic line is not a dominant line, it is enhancing the design by giving our eyes direction and flow through the design. Texture. Texture is the standout element, yes. The juxtaposition of tightly twisted rope, smooth foliage and loose wild coconut husk creates depth and sensory interest. This diversity invites the viewer to look closely and engages them with tactile curiosity. And I think that that's an interesting way of thinking about our designs, is that how often have you been at a competition or you've seen people walking through, the general public walking through and looking at designs and wanting to reach out and touch it. Sometimes it's, is that real? But more often than not, there's just some message in their brain that says, I need to be tactile. I'm curious about the tactile quality of this design, and that is creating a reaction in someone who's looking at it. So that's a good thing. I know that all of my life, if I go somewhere where there is a granite or a stone finish to a building, I have to touch it. Sandstone the same. I have to touch it. I need that tactile connection to the structure that I'm seeing. That's just me. Colour. A naturalistic palette. Soft greens, warm tans and earthy browns. The leaf variegation adds subtle colour dynamics. More accent colour could introduce energy or provide focal contrast if desired. That's something I really have to think about, and it would, for the most part, depend on what the class title actually was. As you know, I just gave this particular title because it was based on what I used as the structure. But had it been in a competition and it was springtime, perhaps, and it would give me more of a sense of the plant material is coiled, ready to spring into life, as was the comment earlier in the analysis. So in that sense, if it was more about spring the season rather than anything else, then I would think about some colour, and I would think about tall plant material that maybe only had one or two flowers out, but the rest were in buds, so they were coiled, ready to burst. So you're probably looking at gladioli, and for that you need a water source. Earlier I was thinking tulips, but I think tulips are too hard to keep upright. But I want something that would reflect that very vertical nature, not something that opens out into a more circular shaped flower. So food for thought in that one, in the colour side of things. So form. The form is compact yet dynamic. The coiled centre provides a cylindrical shape softened by the asymmetrical flare of the foliage and fibre. It reads as a contained boost, visually appropriate to the idea of spring. So it's reflecting both the spring, the physical item, as well as spring, the season, and in that sense could be made into either depending on your class title. So always good to have a practice with something that's around that you haven't used, because if you're attuned to doing a design and testing yourself, you'll come up with a base design that you can use when you see something that reminds you of that in a competition schedule. Space now. The negative space is used effectively within and around the coils, offering visual breathing room and allowing each material to be appreciated. The vertical leaves extend beyond the central structure, creating spatial tension and interest. And that's very true and very important. And also the placement of that front Sansevieria leaf is outside of the base bark, the Banksia slice. So that gives you another dimension, another or extra dimension in that depth of the design as well. Some suggestions now. Introduce a small accent colour, a subtle touch of colour, perhaps a soft spring blossom tucked into the fibre or a seed pod with a touch of a warm hue could reinforce the seasonal theme and introduce a visual focal point. Now, I didn't think about seed pods. And yeah, I can understand about the soft spring blossom. Once again, my feeling is I want to keep that very vertical line as the most important line. I don't want anything to detract from that. So I'd have to really think about and look at, go to the wholesalers or walk around the garden and look at what is there holding up. I'll probably walk around with the Sansevieria leaf and walk around and see what works with this that is a similar sort of shape that's going to repeat that shape or that line forming in the design. Vary coil sizes or rhythm slightly. While the repetition is strong, introducing a slightly different size or spacing in one or two coils might enhance the natural rhythm, giving a sense of organic variation rather than machine repetition. So I think this would very much depend on the class title. I can see what it's saying, but for my interpretation, which was about the physical item that is a spring, I wanted it to be that very much the measured repetition. Had it been something that was more about spring the season, then I would have looked at adjusting the coils, and that's just padding them out. You can still use that metal coil as your structure, and you just pad out every other one so that they are different shapes, different sizes, and then put the rope over the top of that padding. Refine the coconut fibre placement. The fibre could be teased slightly or more evenly or deliberately swept to suggest wind or movement, making it more expressive and less clumped in appearance. I wonder if that might be a reflection of the image itself. The squares of coconut fibre that I've used on the Sansevieria leaves, I deliberately made them squares, and I don't know that it works particularly. I think that it adds a different line and a different visual contrast that I'm not as happy with now as I was initially when I did it. The base of the coiled spring, before you hit the Banksia slice, is actually coconut fibre that is wrapped around the last of the coils in that spring, and perhaps teasing that out a bit more, having a bit more light go through it so that I could see the depth of the design, and then having that shape repeated on the Sansevieria leaves might be something to try, certainly something to look at and try and do the comparison of the photos side by side and see which one works better for the idea that you've got in your head about the class title. Secure the leaf tips. One or two Sansevieria tips could be repositioned or more cleanly trimmed to emphasise intentional form, especially if being judged close up. That might be that I haven't cleaned off the dry bits at the top of those forms, and I can see one of them's got a brown tip on it. So that's another good tip in terms of conditioning of your plant material, because if it's for a competition, you will be judged on the condition of the plant material as well as all of these other things. The only time that you shouldn't be trimming or, in inverted commas, manipulating foliage is when it is for a traditional design, because that will lose you points. So traditional designs, just got to find the most perfect bits of plant material you can and not touch them, not do anything to them. With any other designs, you can trim them, you can take off the brown bits, you can cut them into shapes, all of those sorts of things. So just something that is a fine-tuning point, I guess, for competition, not something you really need to worry about too much until you're faced with that situation. Coiled spring is an elegant textural exploration of natural materials harnessed into a sculptural vertical form. It successfully conveys the theme of spring's potential energy, nature gathering itself, preparing to uncoil into growth. With minor refinements, it could easily transition from an intimate design study to a competition-ready installation or a modern Ikebana interpretation. So very interesting final analysis, given that the only question I ask the AI, DesignEye, is to give me an analysis based on the principles and elements of design. So it's obviously looking at it in terms of it could be any of these things, and it would work well in any of those situations. So definitely something that encourages us, as you would have heard, to see the design in a different light and to start thinking about how you would attempt those things or change things that it is seeing independently in this design. If you're interested in having one of your designs analysed, please go to the website and have a look at what needs to be done. The analysis is usually back to you within 24 hours. It is looked at by a human judge to make sure that it will make sense to you and it will help you in your floral art journey. So there you have it for this week. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review.